Hi, fifth graders. Today we're going to continue our reading of A Tangle of Knots. We're going to read chapter 17, and it's titled Toby. Toby wrestled a slim green suitcase out of the bed of his truck. It had been a small load from the airport this morning, and not a single St. Anthony suitcase. The old man would be disappointed. The front door of the Emporium slammed shut with a whoop pop, and out came an enormous man in a gray suit. "Can you tell me where I might catch the bus to River Street?" the man asked Toby as he walked by. Toby set the suitcase down in the dirt. "You'll want the number 6, he replied. "There is a stop just up the road, to your left at the end of Argyle." "Thank you kindly." "Excuse me," Toby called as the man in the gray suit started down the path. "Aren't you forgetting your bike?" He pointed to the dinged-up bicycle propped against a brown hedge. "I've never seen it before," the man replied with a sideways sort of grin. It was a grin that suggested that he knew more about the world than he was letting on. He walked off down the road. Toby shook his head and began hauling his load of suitcases inside. The store was quiet except for the soft strains of stilted oboe music. The old man was not at his post behind the counter. It was on his last run from the truck that Toby noticed her. He assumed that the person playing the oboe was the curly-haired girl, Marigold, but when he happened to glance at Marigold's bedroom window, it wasn't her head of hair he saw, but a close-cropped gray cut instead, and just enough of her face to recognize her. Suddenly, Toby felt unsettled in a way he hadn't all week. His skin prickled, his cheeks grew hot. He banged closed the back of his truck and lugged the last 2 suitcases, whoop-pop, inside the Emporium to the small office behind the kitchen. He had to leave. They both had to leave. This wretched place had been pushing Toby away for years. But now that there was someone else to think about, Toby found himself actually listening. The Lost Luggage Emporium was no place for a child. He knew that for a fact. Not with the old man and his single-minded whims. But how to explain that to Katie, without having to explain too much? Toby had mostly ironed out the last of his nerves when a slender shadow appeared across the top of the bag he was unzipping. He jerked up his head with a start, but it was only Katie. "Oh," he said, stretching a smile across his face. "Hello there." She blinked at him for a moment, as though adjusting her eyes to the light. "What are you doing?" she asked at last. Toby pulled up a stool for her next to him. "Just sorting through my haul from the airport," he told her. Which things to sell, which things to toss. He plucked a well-read copy of Face Value out of the bag in front of him and pitched it into the toss pile. "I made you some cake," Katie said, holding out the small plate with the fork balanced just so. "These are for you, too." A glass of yellow wildflowers. She set them on the small desk, littered with papers. "Oh, Katie, you didn't have to do that." "Try the cake," she insisted. Toby took a bite. Yellow cake with a creamy chocolate frosting. He pressed the moist crumbs to the roof of his mouth and closed his eyes, wishing that he might someday be the man who was the perfect fit for such a cake. "I'm still working on it," Katie said, leaning forward on the edge of her stool, watching him chew. "Well, it's wonderful." He took another bite. Katie tilted her head to the side. "You don't talk much, you know," she said suddenly. Toby laughed, coughing on a few crumbs. He was growing to quite like this wide-eyed little girl. "I suppose I can be standoffish sometimes," he admitted. "What would you like to know?" Katie shrugged. "I just want to know about you," she said, to help me figure it out about the cake." Toby thought about that. "Let's see," he said slowly. "What can I tell you that might be interesting?" Toby scraped the edge of his fork along the plate, collecting some stray frosting. He didn't want to lie, not more than he had already, but what could he tell her? He searched his brain until he found a memory, a good and true one, that she might enjoy. "When I was younger, I used to travel," he said at last. Katie sat up a little straighter, interested. "What sort of places did you go to?" "Oh." He slipped another bite of cake onto his tongue. "Everywhere," he said, chewing. "Europe, Asia, Australia. If I got an itch, I hopped on a plane and flew clear across the world to scratch it." Katie laughed. "Once I went to Africa too, to get married." They'd flown to Africa to get married, and they'd stay for the adventure. And what an adventure it had been. More than they had bargained for, that was for sure. As soon as their delightful baby daughter was born, they knew it was going to be the adventure of a lifetime. It had all been so wonderful. So we're learning something about Toby. Until suddenly, it was anything but. I went to Africa once. Toby finished at last. So that whole explanation of him in Africa was his thinking. And he just told Katie that he just went to Africa once. He didn't go into detail. Beside him, Katie let out a breath, leaning back against a tall stack of suitcases. I'd love to go somewhere someday, she said. Toby scooped the last bite of cake onto his fork. How about today? Here was his chance. They'd call it a bit of travel, and she'd never have to know the real reason for escaping this dreadful place. We can go anywhere you want. Europe, Ecuador, Ethiopia. He tensed his fingers excitedly around the cake plate. His skin felt warm, tingly at the very idea. We could be on a plane in an hour if we hurry. Start a new life anywhere at all. What about Switzerland? Wouldn't that be nice? Just you and me and some goats? Katie fingered the knotted red flowers on her apron. Or maybe something more metropolitan, Toby suggested. Wouldn't you just love to live in Paris? You could see the Eiffel Tower from your bedroom window. What do you think of that? You must be sick of living in this old place already. The grumpy old man alone is enough to make someone want to leave forever. Katie bent to pick up the fork that had fallen off Toby's cake plate. Katie? She looked up. Well, she said slowly, we can't go tonight, can we? Because of the bake-off. Toby shifted his face into a smile. Of course, he said. Tomorrow, then. I mean, assuming it all goes well with Miss Mallory. Do you think... Katie's voice grew so quiet it was almost like a whisper. I do want to stay, you know, she said. I really like it here. At the Emporium, I mean. Toby let her take his empty cake plate. There were too many things, too many people who could so easily ruin the life he and Katie had started together. But there was no easy way to tell her all of that. I really should get back to my work, he said instead. Thanks again for the cake. Think about what you think he means by that statement. There were too many things, too many people who could so easily ruin the life he and Katie had started together. But there was no easy way to tell her all of that. So he says, thanks again for the cake. You liked it? He smiled again, a sincere one. The smiling was getting easier this week. I loved it, he told her. Toby might have failed at being a father once. He thought as Katie headed back to the kitchen. But there was no way he was going to fail again. He'd do whatever it took, but he was not going to fail. That's the end of chapter 17. Have a great day.